Afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to talk about human factors validation studies. And this is going to give a detailed analysis of the validation study. The validation study is the final step in the human factors program. Now, the human factors program is determined by two governing documents. There's an FDA guidance applying human factors and usability engineering to medical devices issued in 2016, and there's also the ANSI/AAMI IEC 62366 document, Medical Devices Application of Usability Engineering to Medical Devices. This is an FDA-recognized standard. Now, these two documents are practically identical. There's a few minor differences which I'll point out, but everything that I say is applicable to both documents. Now, what is validation, human factors validation? The purpose of the validation is to demonstrate that the device can be used by representative users under simulated use conditions without producing patterns of failures that could result in a negative clinical impact to patients or harm to users. Now, notice there's no numbers in this definition. Human factors validation, unlike an engineering validation, is a qualitative validation. The FDA feels, and ISO feel, that trying to create numbers, quantitative conditions, acceptance conditions, is unrealistic. Using numbers is arbitrary. If you say 80% were successful, what really does that mean? So what the FDA and ISO want in terms of validation is for you to be able to make this statement and defend it with data. So you're going to make a qualitative statement about the safety and use of the device, and you will defend it with the data that you obtained from your testing. So how do you do this? You observe the user using the device in a realistic use environment. As part of that, you verify that a training program, if you have a training program, and the IFU, information for use documentation, are effective. You also ensure that use-related hazards have been successfully mitigated before you start the validation. Let's go through some definitions so we have an understanding of the terms. A use scenario. That's a brief description of the sequence of user-device interactions. It's a description of the use of the device as the user performs specific tasks. It's a small story about how the user uses the device in one small segment of the use. An example would be preparing an infusion pump for use. That would be one use scenario. It would be followed by other use scenarios, such as using the infusion pump and then closing down the infusion pump. Part of the use scenario is tasks. Use scenario is composed of tasks, which are steps within the use scenario. Some steps within the use scenario of preparing an infusion pump for use are install a tubing set into the pump. Now, for complex scenarios, it might be helpful to create subtasks, but usually that's not necessary. Critical task. A user task which, if performed incorrectly or not performed, could cause serious harm to user, where the harm includes compromised medical care. Essential task is a task necessary for successful use of the device, but failure creates no risk of harm to user. So essential task is necessary for the use of the device, but a critical task is where harm can happen to the user. A hazard-related use scenario. If a use scenario leads to a hazardous situation, it's a hazard-related use scenario. Use error. User action or lack of action that leads to a different result than that intended. Okay, validation. As I said, we're going to observe the user using the device and document the observations. As part of that test, we'll introduce errors to test alarm response, if that's appropriate. We'll introduce alerts to test responsiveness. For instance, a fib alert on a heart monitor. We're going to simulate the user environment as realistically as possible. Now, that's an important point because the FDA has rejected studies that were conducted in a bare room where there was no attempt to simulate the user environment. Following the test, there's a post-test interview of each participant. The interview should be conducted immediately after the test. You want fresh thoughts, fresh observations. The interview should focus on critical tasks. You should discuss difficulties, confusion, errors, as well as failures. You should obtain an overall device impression as well as discuss the issues. If there were errors, difficulties, confusions, you want to get the participant's idea of what the problem was. You want his assessment of the root cause. You don't want to rely on a later assessment by a design engineer. And you should address the emotional aspect. Does the device make the patient uncomfortable? Or is he comfortable using the device? That could affect the outcome for other people. Now, the testing under conditions of simulated use is okay, but actual conditions are preferable if it can be accomplished, usually not. The test participants must represent actual users, and they cannot have prior experience with the device. This excludes company employees, even if they fit the profile of a participant. They have some implied knowledge of the device. And appropriate environmental factors must be included. For home environment, you might want to have low lighting, noise, background noise, traffic noise. For a clinical environment, bright lighting. To do the validation, we first select tasks and use scenarios that are to be tested. Now, all essential and all critical tasks that we've identified must be performed. Tasks requiring response to alarms are considered critical tasks and must be tested. Hazard-related use scenarios must be tested. And we can choose other tasks and scenarios based on the preliminary analysis that we've conducted throughout the design program. Also, we can use feedback from post-market information about other similar devices to select tasks to be tested. You should provide a rationale for the tests that you're chosen and the tests not chosen. Let's talk about participants in the study. During your formative studies, during the human factors program, you've defined user groups, the distinct user populations. These are a subset of intended users who are differentiated from other intended users by factors that are likely to influence usability. This might be adult and elderly. The adult may be one group and the elderly another group if there are factors that would differentiate them, or pediatric and adult, or lay people and health professional. If it's a complex instrument, it may be appropriate to have two groups, lay people who would not be as familiar and as able to operate the instrument as easily as a health professional. And these groups are defined for your specific product, because they may be distinct groups for your product, but not for another product. Depends on the device and the application. The user profiles should have been developed during the human factors program. These are a summary of mental, physical, and demographic traits of a user group. The age range, weight range, the education that is necessary, the experience that's necessary to operate the device. Now, the participants for a specific user group should represent the range of the characteristics of that user group. So if you have an age range, your participants should cover the age range. Now let's talk about participant criteria. It's always been unknown exactly how many people should participate in these studies. The FDA has never provided an answer. Companies would question the FDA and they would say it depends. Leave it to the company to make a judgment about how many people are appropriate, and hope the FDA agreed. With the publication of this latest guidance, the FDA has come up with an answer. What they're saying is there must be a minimum of 15 participants from each distinct user population. And these are based on the user population groups and the profiles that were developed earlier. Now, if you cannot get 15 people, you must document a rationale for not having 15 people. I had a recent project where the device was used by highly specialized people, and there weren't 15 people in the entire reasonable geographic area who could operate the device. who had the medical background for the device. So this was a good rationale for deviation from 15 people, but usually you should have 15 people. As mentioned before, company employees should not be test participants. Also, the FDA has said that participants must reside in the United States, which means the study must be conducted in the United States. The reason is different clinical practices elsewhere, different cultural factors. Even translated labeling could introduce problems because a literal translation may not take into account cultural factors. Now, this is the FDA's criteria. IEC 62366 does not specify a participant size. So they are not for Europe and out of the United States. There is no criteria except for MHRA, which also requires 15 participants. The user manual and the training program, if you are providing a training program, must be tested prior to validation. It must be validated separately. The reason is you want the validation to be conducted using the final version of the user manual and the final training program. So the user manual and the training program must be validated first separately. Another very important point, the FDA concentrates on this. If you have a training program for users, you must allow a dwell time between training and testing. The purpose of this is to give the user time to forget what you taught him. It can be 1 hour, could be several days. You must document the rationale for the dwell time that you're chosen. During that dwell time, the user should not study the information for use. This is a very important point. The FDA focuses on the dwell time and the rationale for the dwell time. You should be aware of a possible conflict between your usability study and an unapproved clinical study. You don't want to be involved in an IRB type situation. You cannot deliver therapy to a participant. Example would be you have a device that assists with injections. Well, you cannot actually inject the subject as part of this usability validation, but you should use a dummy with data to support equivalence to injecting a human. That's a simplistic example, but it gets the point across. Another point, you should conduct sufficient human factor studies during device development, called the formative studies, until you're confident that there'll be no failures during validation. You want the validation to be no surprises. You want the validation to be the documentation of a successful development. So you should conduct sufficient preliminary studies beforehand. The prerequisites for actually conducting the validation test. You should have completed human factors preliminary analyses following the ISO and the FDA guidances. You should have a completed risk analysis following ISO 14971, keeping in mind that human factors hazard analysis considers only severity of harm, not probability. FDA feels you cannot reasonably estimate the probability of a person committing an error. You should have a list of known use-related hazards. And this comes from reviewing FDA literature, FDA databases, reviewing your own company data, reviewing industry data information. All of these identified use-related hazards should be documented and tracked to tasks to assure that they are included in testing. So you want to be able to demonstrate that you've identified use-related hazards and you've considered them in your human factors validation. You should have a list of hazard-related use scenarios from your human factors analysis. You should create a list of essential tasks and critical tasks. The validation must include these, and you should be able to trace from your list to your actual test. You should have inclusion and exclusion criteria for the test participants, and you should document the test participants and how they meet the inclusion or exclusion criteria. Now, as with everything else, we start off with a test plan. We describe the intended uses of the device and the users. These are the user populations, distinct user populations. We described the intended use environments: home environment, clinical environment, emergency room. We described the user interface. We described the training and the decay time and the rationales for the decay time. We describe the product in detail, including any accessories that are provided or recommended. As part of a pre-submission program, you can submit your test plan to the FDA for feedback. This is a very good idea, especially to get the FDA agreement on your definition of user groups. Because 15 people adds up very easily to quite large groups. As part of the test plan, you can identify critical and essential tasks. Identify the possible user error for the task. What is the potential harm of that user error? And the severity level of the harm. And for those tasks, the critical and essential tasks, what are the associated use scenarios? Test plan would also have a detailed descriptions of the tests of the scenarios and the tasks. And before any testing is conducted, each participant should sign an informed consent form. This form would contain the purpose of the test, any description of risks to participant, a clause on data confidentiality, that the participant will keep the data confidential, a clause on product confidentiality, and a clause giving the company permission to take photographs and record video of the test. Now, device must be production representative. The labeling must be the final version. Drafts are okay. It doesn't have to be fancy 4-color manuals, but it has to be the final version. Training must be the final version. If there is pre-test training, it should be one-on-one to simulate healthcare professional training rather than a group. And again, it should allow for decay time. Now, an overview of the sequence of the procedure, and then we'll go into detail about it. First, we review the inclusion-exclusion criteria for the participants and be sure they meet the criteria. The signing of the informed consent form. In the actual study, there is an introduction by a moderator, and he follows a script so that he's saying the same thing to all participants. The actual testing is done. There's the post-test inquiry, the interview, and then data analysis of all the participants' results. An overview of the actual test procedure. The participant is given the device in its packaging with its documentation, but with no specific instructions to use the documentations. The moderator describes the scenario to be tested to the participant. It's important to emphasize to the user that the test is of device functionality, not user performance. You want the user relaxed, that he's not thinking that he's being judged, but that it is the device that's being evaluated. During a test, the participant can use the information for use, but he's not directed to use it. It's his choice. The participant uses the device per the use scenario that's being tested, and he's observed and he's recorded. Now, it's good to introduce problems, alarms, errors, to test the recovery action, participant recovery actions. Following the test, the moderator asks questions about each task, including successful tasks. Preferably, only open-ended questions are asked. You ask if there's anything that caused the participant to be concerned or to hesitate. You ask for root cause, the participant's root cause for use errors or difficulties. If he had a difficulty, why did he think he had that difficulty? Information for use. Following the test, you can test the participant on his knowledge of the information for use. You don't want to do it before because that gives him some extra training. Again, follow a prepared script so that everybody gets the same questions. You can test on contraindications, on the warnings, on faults that are not feasible to test. What does he know about a possible fault? What to do about a possible fault that you couldn't simulate? If your information for use is a lengthy user manual, very thick, you can determine if the users can locate specific sections, if they're familiar with the contents and can locate information. They may not know the information for a lengthy IFU, but can they locate it? You want to relate the user knowledge to the user performance. All the questions that you ask should have a severity ranking. And the purpose of this is to evaluate the importance of the answers. Now, the test room. You have the monitor and you have the participant in the room. You would have a scribe behind a one-way mirror. The room will be set up to simulate the use environment. The factors such as lighting, noise, we take into consideration. If you're simulating a home environment, you might want to put in a couch, some house plants, a TV. You might then have the TV on to simulate TV noise. You might simulate traffic noise. Now you have two cameras, preferable. One to capture facial expressions and one to capture the actual interactions with the device. And there are many artificial intelligence programs available for interpreting facial expressions. The pre-test introduction. The moderator introduces himself, gives a high-level test overview, describes the test, purpose of the test. Again, he follows a guide so that everybody gets the same information. He explains any test equipment, any cameras, microphones, whatever. He engages in some light conversation to relax the participant. Now let's talk for a minute about data collection and data analysis. There are several categories of data. There's observation data. There's errors, confusions, close calls. There's knowledge data, which you obtain from actual tests. And then there's interview data, where you ask the participant questions. You should analyze all use errors, confusions, close calls. You don't want to restrict your analysis to the errors, failures, and determine the root cause for all errors, confusions, close calls. Now, it's an important point that the time to complete a task is not a valid metric. You cannot have a criteria where if the person completes the use of the device within X minutes, that's a success. That is not a valid metric. some typical post-test questions. They should be open-ended. You don't want to say, did you see the light that indicated the end of therapy? That's a yes-no question and leads the participant. You want to ask an open-ended question. How did you know therapy ended? And the participant would say he saw a light, indication light. Okay, good. You should be sure the questions are free from bias and beware of responses where the participant is trying to please the moderator, not being critical because he wants to please the moderator. Ask, what did you think of the device? Did you have any trouble using it? What kind of trouble? Was anything confusing? What made it confusing? What information was helpful? And then if there was a difficulty, ask the participant his thoughts about that difficulty. Ask them when he referenced the manual, what did you read? Again, these are all open-ended questions. Now for the analysis. The use errors that would not result in harm need less analysis than errors that could result in serious harm. You should determine the root cause for any problems, difficulties. Do not blame the participant for forgetting. You should determine the possible mitigations to these problems. Do we need design modifications? If you do propose mitigations, do these mitigations introduce new risks? Have you created a new risk by your solution to one risk? Now let's talk a bit about root cause analysis. You want to find out if the problem is due to the device design, to the documentation, to the training, to the packaging, or if there's a, quote, artifact of the test. Now, an artifact of the test is when a participant fails to complete a task or has difficulty because of the test scenario. It's a factor that's unique to the test situation but not related to the device. So there was a problem because of the nature of the test, the construction of the test, and not due to the operation of the device. If this is the situation, you should document the rationale for deciding this. For root cause, 5 whys is a very effective technique for determining root cause. And very simply, you repeatedly ask why. You ask why did something happen, and you get an answer. And you follow it up with a why did the answer happen, and so on. And experience has shown that within 5 attempts like this, you will come up with the final root cause. Now, for tracking purposes, another analysis is you can place the root cause into categories. And these categories are called slip, an action not carried out as intended, or a lapse. The participant missed an action or a mission he forgot. Mistake. an action believed to be correct, but in fact wrong. Intentional misuse, deliberately not following procedure. The participant thought he knew better than the manual or what was told to him, and he followed his own thoughts. Here's a few ideas that are very important about mental models. What the participant believes about the use of the device. There's negative transfer, which is incorrect behavior carried over from a previous or similar device. The participant has used a similar device in the past. He knows how to use it well, and he believes that the new device should operate the same way. Or there's the mental model. This is similar, but the participant doesn't have any previous knowledge, but he has intuition about how the device should function. So he does an incorrect action because he thought he knew how best to operate the device. Then there's capture error. The user is in a routine pattern, pushing one button repeatedly, because that's what the device calls for, and then a novel response is called for. A new category of question, maybe. So he performs an incorrect action because he's captured by this routine pattern. And then there's the artifact of the study that we just discussed. So mitigations. A good rule of thumb is you should do the feasible mitigation, not try and evade it. If you can think of a mitigation for a problem, the FDA will also. They're pretty smart. They will review your documentation, and they will ask, why didn't you do this type of mitigation? So if you can think of a mitigation, do it. Use a benefit versus risk argument as a last resort. FDA frowns on trying to use benefit versus risk arguments to get out of actually doing mitigations. Let's talk about success. As I mentioned before, you can't use quantitative criteria. You can't say something like 95% of tests were successfully completed. So that's kind of arbitrary. What does that mean? The success of validation is a qualitative conclusion backed up by data and discussion. And that conclusion would be the device has been found to be safe and effective for the intended users, uses, and use environments. Participants demonstrated a high level of success in using the device. And notice we said high level, we didn't say 100%. So you can have a successful validation without having 100% success. Other parts of the conclusion, the IFU, were easy to understand and follow. The user interface was easy to navigate and operate. Now this is your conclusion, and you must be able to back it up by your test data. And you will explain your test data to support that conclusion. Now, if you do some mitigations, you should test the redesign. However, you only have to test those aspects of the design that were affected by the changes. You do not have to do a complete new validation. And your rationale for what you're testing and what you're not testing should be documented. Residual risks, very important subject for ISO and FDA. All risks that remain following validation testing should be thoroughly analyzed to determine if they can be reduced or eliminated. The residual risks that can't be must be disclosed in the labeling, either on the device itself or in the manual. Now, if you have serious use errors, then you do a risk-benefit analysis, and you may have to redesign. At the end of the test and the analysis, you would create a test report. Now, a test report is mentioned both by the FDA and by IEC. IEC casually mentions they want a test report. FDA places great emphasis on a test report. It's very important to the FDA. They provide in their guidance, they provide a format. They provide a separate section on preparing a test report. So it's important you follow their format. It makes it easy for them to analyze your test report. It makes it easy for you as a result. So I won't go through the format because it's very carefully described in the guidance, but a couple of sections of it are important. First, the conclusion section. As we said, you're concluding the device is safe and effective for the intended users, uses, and use environments. In the conclusion section, you're going to summarize the processes that you conducted, the analyses, the testing, any design mods you did. You're going to discuss in detail the remaining residual risk. Be careful to give enough detail about that. You're going to discuss your rationale that your design modifications would not further reduce risk. You're going to discuss, if it's appropriate, the risk-benefit analysis. Another section is a summary. This is where you include your user population description, your intended use description, your use environment description, and the training that you provided to participants. You're going to describe the user interface, a description of the device, description of the interface, the labeling, and an overview of the operation sequence. You're going to list your summary of known use problems that you developed before and describe your risk analysis, your hazardous scenarios, the harms, the severity, the risk control measures, and your evidence of the effectiveness of risk control measures, your testing that shows that your risk control measures were effective. You're going to provide a summary of the preliminary analysis that you did throughout the development program of the device, the human factors preliminary analysis. You're going to describe the critical tasks. You're going to describe how you identified, what was your criteria to call something a critical task. You have a list of the critical tasks. For each critical task, you'll list the severity of the harm and the use scenarios that correspond for each critical task. your test report. This is where you show why you can conclude the device was safe and effective. This is your results analysis. And there's many ways to present the data, and it really depends on the particular device and the test. But typical explanation analysis would be first explain any deviations from the protocol and present your data in tables. You might have a table of user group success failures across the tasks, across the scenarios. A table of performance on critical tasks. A table of performance on essential tasks. A table of task and scenario performance by the individuals. Now here's an important point. In your test report, in your test documentation, use codes to identify individuals, not people's names. This gets into patient confidentiality and health information. In your files, you will have a table showing the names of people and their codes so that you can track. But in the documentation, you use codes to identify people. You could have a table of information for use comprehension by user groups or by individuals. A table of use errors and issues by severity. Again, the presentation should be developed for the specific product. You then have a discussion of results, discussing the close calls, difficulties, failures, explanation of any design modifications that were made, the risk-benefit discussion, if that's appropriate. And you can pen the test protocol and your scripts. And here's some references. Got a good part. That'd be good to have in your library. Now, human factors is part of design control. You must have SOPs to control the design control program and to control the human factors program. The SOPs that you should have is one, how to describe the human factors and usability plan, how to create a use specification, how to do the usability hazard analysis, how to create the usability interface specification, how to create the interface evaluation plan, the design verification and validation, and how to create the usability final report. Now you could write these SOPs from scratch and spend a lot of time on that, or you could get easily customizable SOPs and just edit them for your particular company at www.meddeviceadvisors.com. Now the FDA realizes human factors is complex, difficult, not straightforward. So here's 2 locations where you can get help from the FDA for general questions and more detailed technical questions. That's the end of the presentation. I'll be glad to take questions.